The battering ram struck the front door at exactly 4:17 a.m., splintering wood and shattering the peaceful morning silence of Maple Creek subdivision. 7-year-old Lynn Nguyen jolted awake as tactical boots thundered across her family's hardwood floors, her small body trembling as flashlight beams carved through the darkness of her bedroom. The sound of her mother's terrified screams pierced the air like broken glass. "Get down! Get down now!" The commands came in rapid succession, harsh voices barking orders as little Lynn pressed herself against her bedroom wall, watching through her cracked door as black-clad figures swarmed through her home. Her father's voice, usually so gentle when reading her bedtime stories, now carried a desperate edge as he tried to explain something to the officers who had forced him to his knees in the living room. 3 hours earlier, the Nguyen family had been sleeping peacefully in their modest two-story home on Elm Street, the same house where they had lived quietly for 8 years. Mai Nguyen had finished her late shift at the hospital, her nurse's uniform still hanging in the laundry room. Her husband Duke was preparing for another day at his auto repair shop, while their 2 children, Lynn and 12-year-old Tommy, dreamed of weekend plans and soccer practice. The family had immigrated from Ho Chi Minh City when Lynn was still a baby, chasing the American dream with nothing but determination and their savings from selling everything they owned. Duke's calloused hands spoke of countless hours spent fixing engines and building a reputation for honest work, while Mai's gentle touch had comforted hundreds of patients during her night shifts at St. Mary's Medical Center. They were the kind of neighbors who brought homemade pho to new families, who shoveled snow from elderly Mrs. Peterson's driveway without being asked, who kept their lawn immaculately trimmed and their children well-behaved. Tommy excelled in mathematics and played violin in the school orchestra. Lynn collected butterflies and painted watercolor pictures that Mai proudly displayed on their refrigerator. But none of that mattered to Karen Whitfield, who lived 3 houses down in a sprawling colonial that had been in her family for 2 generations. Karen had watched the Nguyen family with growing resentment ever since they had respectfully asked her to turn down her music during one of her frequent backyard parties last summer. The request had been polite, delivered by Duke with a shy smile and broken English, explaining that the children had school the next day. Karen had smiled tightly and agreed, but something cold had settled in her chest that night. How dare these people, these foreigners, tell her what to do in her own neighborhood, the neighborhood where her grandmother had lived, where she had grown up, where she belonged. The incident that would shatter 2 families began on a Tuesday evening in October. Duke had been working late in his garage, rebuilding an engine for a customer's vintage Mustang. The rhythmic sounds of metal on metal, the hiss of his air compressor, and the occasional clang of drop tools carried across the quiet suburban street as darkness fell. Karen stood at her kitchen window, wineglass in hand, watching the light spill from the Nguyen garage with mounting irritation. She had tried to watch her evening news programs, but the mechanical sounds kept interrupting her concentration. Each clang seemed to strike directly against her nerves. At 9:30 p.m., she marched across the street in her silk robe and slippers, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. Duke looked up from his work, oil-stained coveralls and tired eyes, as she appeared in his garage doorway like an avenging angel. "Do you have any idea how inconsiderate you're being?" Karen's voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Some of us have important jobs and need our rest." Duke straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a shop rag. His English was heavily accented, but clear. "I am very sorry. Mrs. Whitfield, I try to finish this work. Customer needs car tomorrow morning for job interview." "I don't care about your customers' problems. This is a residential neighborhood, not an industrial zone. There are noise ordinances, you know." Duke nodded respectfully, already beginning to clean up his tools. Yes, yes, I understand. I finish now. Very sorry for trouble. But Karen wasn't finished. Something in his immediate compliance, his willingness to stop his work, only fueled her anger further. You people think you can just come here and do whatever you want, don't you? Well, let me tell you something about how things work in America. The words hung in the air like poison. Duke's hands stilled on his wrench, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but a deep sadness that spoke of other encounters, other moments when his otherness had been weaponized against him. I am an American citizen, he said quietly. My children born here. We love this country very much. Karen's face flushed red. Citizen or not, you need to learn respect. And if you can't figure that out on your own, maybe someone needs to teach you. She turned and stalked back to her house, leaving Duke standing in his garage, staring after her retreating figure. He finished cleaning up in silence, his movements careful and deliberate, before closing the garage door and walking slowly back to his house where Mai waited with a cup of tea and worried eyes. For 3 weeks, an uneasy peace settled over Elm Street. Duke worked shorter hours in his garage and kept his compressor running only during daylight hours. The family attended Tommy's school concert and Lynn's art show, smiling and clapping with other parents who had no idea that their neighbors were walking on eggshells. But Karen was watching. She documented every delivery truck that visited the Nguyen house, every late arrival from Duke's shop, every gathering of family friends for Sunday dinner. She convinced herself she was being vigilant, protecting her neighborhood from people who clearly didn't understand American values. The breaking point came on a cold November morning, when a delivery truck brought supplies for Duke's garage. Among the packages were automotive chemicals, welding supplies, and compressed gas tanks for his equipment. To anyone familiar with auto repair, the delivery was routine. To Karen, peering through her blinds with imagination running wild, it looked like something far more sinister. She had been reading online forums, absorbing conspiracy theories and fear-mongering articles about sleeper cells and domestic terrorism. The packages, combined with her existing resentment, transformed in her mind into evidence of a plot. These people, these foreigners, were planning something terrible in her neighborhood. That night, Karen called 911. "This is an emergency," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. "My neighbors, the Vietnamese family on Elm Street, they're making bombs in their garage. I've seen them receiving chemicals and equipment. They work at odd hours, making loud noises. I think they're planning an attack." The dispatcher asked for more details, for specific observations, for any direct evidence of illegal activity. Karen provided a creative narrative built on genuine deliveries, but twisted through the lens of paranoia and prejudice. She mentioned the late-night garage work, the chemical deliveries, the secretive behavior of a family that had always been friendly, but private. "They keep to themselves," she insisted, "never really integrated into the community. And now, with all these supplies arriving, I'm genuinely afraid for my safety and the safety of my neighbors." The call triggered protocols designed to protect public safety, but the system wasn't equipped to filter out malicious false reports disguised as concerned citizenship. Within hours, a SWAT team was assembled, search warrants were expedited, and tactical plans were drawn for what authorities believed might be a terrorist cell operating in suburban America. No one bothered to check Duke's business license, his tax records, or his sterling reputation in the community. No one spoke to the customers whose cars he had faithfully repaired for years. No one verified the specific nature of the deliveries, or consulted with experts who could have immediately identified legitimate automotive supplies. Instead, they believed Karen. At 4:17 a.m., the battering ram struck. Tommy was dragged from his bed in his Batman pajamas, his hands zip-tied behind his back as he sobbed for his mother. Lynn screamed as officers ransacked her room, dumping her art supplies and schoolbooks in their search for explosive materials. Mai was thrown against the hallway wall, her nurse's scrubs torn as she begged the officers to let her comfort her terrified children. Duke suffered the worst treatment. When he tried to explain about his auto shop, when he offered to show them his business licenses and customer invoices, an officer's knee pressed into his back drove his face into the living room carpet. Blood from his split lip stained the beige fibers as he gasped for breath. "Please," he wheezed. "I fix cars. Just cars. My children. Please don't scare my children." The house was systematically destroyed. Officers ripped apart furniture, looking for hidden compartments, smashed through drywall checking for secret rooms, and dumped the contents of every drawer and cabinet onto the floors. Mai's carefully tended herb garden was trampled. Tommy's violin, left on the kitchen counter from practice the night before, was knocked to the floor and stepped on, its strings snapping with small, sharp sounds like breaking hearts. In the garage, the forensics team found exactly what anyone familiar with auto repair would expect: legitimate automotive chemicals, welding equipment, and compressed gases used for various repair processes. Nothing remotely resembling explosive materials. Nothing that couldn't be found in any professional garage across America. But the damage was done. By sunrise, news vans lined Elm Street. Neighbors emerged from their houses to find their quiet subdivision swarming with reporters, police vehicles, and curious onlookers drawn by social media posts about a terrorist raid. The Nguyen house sat exposed, its front door hanging from broken hinges, its windows shattered, its front yard torn up by tactical vehicles. Karen stood on her front porch in a fresh outfit and carefully applied makeup, ready to play the role of the vigilant citizen who had saved her neighborhood from disaster. She gave interviews describing her growing concerns and her brave decision to contact authorities. "I knew something wasn't right," she told a local news reporter, the camera capturing her expression of manufactured concern. "As Americans, we have a responsibility to report suspicious activity. I'm just glad I acted before something terrible happened." But across the street, the terrible thing had already happened. Tommy sat on the curb, wrapped in a blanket provided by a paramedic, staring at his destroyed home with the hollow eyes of someone far too young to understand how quickly safety could be shattered. Lynn clung to her mother, refusing to let go even as Mai tried to answer questions from investigators who were beginning to realize the magnitude of their error. Duke was taken to the hospital with 3 cracked ribs and a concussion. The official report would later describe his injuries as minor and accidental. But Mai knew the truth. She had seen the officer's knee, had heard her husband's labored breathing, had watched him lose consciousness on their living room floor. By noon, the forensics team had concluded their investigation. No explosive materials found, no evidence of terrorist activity, no indication of any illegal behavior whatsoever. The automotive supplies were exactly what they appeared to be: tools of an honest man's trade. The story should have ended there, with apologies and explanations, with officials quietly admitting their mistake and promising to review their procedures. But social media had already seized the narrative. "Vietnamese terrorists" was trending on Twitter, accompanied by photos of the destroyed house and speculation about what they were really planning. Anonymous accounts shared Karen's interview clips with inflammatory commentary. Neo-Nazi forums picked up the story as evidence of their racial theories. The Nguyen family's faces were plastered across websites devoted to anti-immigrant propaganda, their lives dissected and distorted by people who had never met them but had already decided their guilt. Tommy stopped going to school after classmates began asking if his family were bad guys. Lynn developed nightmares and refused to sleep in her own room, which still bore the scars of the raid. Mai requested a transfer to day shifts because she could no longer handle the isolation of working nights while her family struggled with trauma. But Duke's injuries ran deeper than broken ribs. The man who had always greeted neighbors with a smile now avoided eye contact when checking the mail. He jumped at sudden noises and installed multiple locks on doors that had never needed them before. His auto shop, once thriving, began to lose customers who had seen the news coverage and decided they didn't want to associate with that family. The turning point came 6 weeks later, during a routine community association meeting held in the elementary school gymnasium. Karen attended, as she always did, representing herself as a pillar of neighborhood stability. She expected sympathy, perhaps even praise for her vigilant actions. Instead, she found herself facing Dr. Jennifer Chen, a forensic chemist who lived 2 streets over and had been following the case with growing outrage. "I've reviewed the inventory of materials found in the Nguyen garage," Dr. Chen announced, standing at the back of the room with a folder full of documentation. As someone with a PhD in chemistry and 15 years of experience in forensic analysis, I can state categorically that nothing found in that garage could be used to manufacture explosives. The room fell silent. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Furthermore," Dr. Chen continued, "I've spoken with 3 other auto repair professionals in our area. The chemicals and equipment found were standard automotive supplies. Anyone with basic knowledge of car repair would have recognized them as such." She opened her folder and began reading from a prepared statement. "Acetylene gas for welding, brake cleaner for automotive maintenance, metal cutting tools for bodywork. These are not bomb-making materials. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the tools of an honest businessman trying to support his family." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several neighbors who had been present during the raid shifted uncomfortably, beginning to realize they had witnessed something far different from what they had initially believed. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished. She had spent weeks investigating, driven by her own experiences as an Asian American professional who understood how quickly suspicion could be weaponized against people who looked different. "I've also obtained call logs from 911 dispatch," she announced, her voice growing stronger. "The call that triggered this raid was made by someone in this room, someone who admitted to having no direct evidence of illegal activity, but reported their concerns about a Vietnamese family based on nothing more than legitimate business deliveries and late-night work in a private garage." Karen's face went pale. She had not expected anyone to investigate this deeply, had not imagined that her carefully constructed narrative would be dismantled by someone with actual expertise. "That's enough!" Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the gymnasium floor. "I reported what I saw. I did my civic duty. If the police made mistakes in their response, that's not my fault." "What exactly did you see?" Dr. Chen's voice was calm but relentless. "Can you describe, in scientific terms, what made you believe automotive chemicals were explosive materials? Can you explain why you didn't simply talk to your neighbors before calling in a SWAT team?" The room was dead silent now. Every eye focused on Karen, who found herself trapped by her own lies and the growing realization that her neighbors were beginning to see through her performance. I saw deliveries, suspicious packages. They were working at all hours, making noise, being secretive. Karen's voice was rising, becoming shrill. They don't fit in here. They don't belong in this neighborhood. The words hung in the air like a confession. The mask had slipped, revealing the ugly truth that had motivated her actions. Not concern for public safety, but simple, virulent racism. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman whose driveway Duke had shoveled for years, stood slowly from her seat in the front row. Her voice, though weak with age, carried clearly through the silent gymnasium. "That young man has been nothing but kind to me," she said, her words measured and deliberate. "When I fell on my ice last winter, he's the one who helped me up and made sure I got safely inside. When my car wouldn't start, he fixed it for free. And you." She turned to face Karen directly. "You destroyed his family because you didn't like the sound of honest work being done in his own garage." Other voices began to join hers. Parents whose children played with Tommy and Lynn. Customers who had brought their cars to Duke's shop. Colleagues who worked with Mai at the hospital. One by one, they stood to defend a family that had been torn apart by one woman's malicious lies. Karen found herself isolated in a room full of neighbors who were finally seeing her clearly. The sympathetic audience she had expected had transformed into something else, entirely a community confronting its own failure to protect innocent people from hatred disguised as vigilance. Dr. Chen pulled out another document from her folder. "I've also been in contact with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Filing false reports, targeting individuals based on their race or ethnicity, constitutes a hate crime under federal law. The destruction of the Nguyen family's property, the trauma inflicted on their children, and the damage to Mr. Nguyen's business all have legal consequences." Karen's face went from pale to ashen. She had never considered that her actions might have legal ramifications, had assumed that claiming public safety concerns would protect her from any consequences. "You can't prove intent," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. "I was protecting my neighborhood. That's not a crime." "Your own 911 call proves intent," Dr. Chen replied smoothly. "You specifically mentioned their Vietnamese ethnicity. You admitted you had no direct evidence of wrongdoing. You described legitimate automotive supplies as bomb-making materials without any basis in fact. That's not protection, Mrs. Whitfield. That's persecution." The meeting devolved into heated discussions as neighbors grappled with their collective guilt and growing anger at Karen's actions. Some demanded her immediate removal from the community association. Others called for financial compensation for the Nguyen family. A few suggested organizing a neighborhood support campaign to help repair the damage to their home and their lives. Karen left the meeting early, slipping out a side door as the discussions continued around her empty chair. But she had heard enough to know that her comfortable life in Maple Creek was about to change dramatically. Within a week, the FBI Civil Rights Division had opened a formal investigation. Karen's phone records, internet search history, and social media activity painted a clear picture of someone who had been radicalized by online hate groups and had targeted the Nguyen family specifically because of their ethnicity. The evidence was overwhelming. Searches for how to report suspicious neighbors and signs of terrorist activity mixed with visits to white supremacist websites and anti-immigrant forums. Text messages to friends containing racial slurs and complaints about foreigners taking over the neighborhood. A digital trail that chronicled her transformation from merely prejudiced to actively dangerous. The civil lawsuit filed by the Nguyen family's attorneys was equally devastating. Medical bills for Duke's injuries, therapy costs for trauma treatment for both children, lost income from customers who had abandoned his auto shop, property damage to their home and belongings, pain and suffering awards that reflected the magnitude of what had been done to an innocent family. But the most powerful evidence came from the children themselves. Tommy's testimony, delivered via video link to protect his privacy, described the terror of being dragged from his bed and watching his father beaten unconscious. Lynn's drawings, created during therapy sessions, showed dark figures invading a house while a family cowered in fear. Karen's attorneys tried to argue that she had acted in good faith, that her concerns were legitimate, even if misguided. But the evidence painted a different picture entirely. A woman who had used the machinery of law enforcement as a weapon against neighbors she simply didn't want in her community. The community response was swift and decisive. Karen's membership in the Homeowners Association was revoked. Her real estate license was suspended pending investigation by the state regulatory board. Local businesses that had employed her consulting services terminated their contracts, unwilling to be associated with someone who had become a symbol of racist vigilantism. More significantly, the neighborhood itself began to change. The trauma of watching an innocent family destroyed by hatred had forced residents to confront uncomfortable truths about their own community. Support groups formed to help the Nguyen family rebuild their lives. Diversity and inclusion workshops were organized to prevent similar incidents in the future. Dr. Chen established a neighborhood watch program focused on actual community safety rather than suspicion of difference. Mrs. Peterson organized a fundraising drive that raised enough money to completely renovate the Nguyen home and provide college funds for both children. Tommy's school implemented anti-bullying programs after several students admitted to harassing him following the raid. 6 months after the false 911 call, Karen faced the consequences of her actions in federal court. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience in civil rights cases, showed no sympathy for Karen's claims of good intentions. "You weaponized law enforcement against an innocent family based solely on their ethnicity," the judge stated during sentencing. "Your actions caused immeasurable trauma to 2 children, destroyed a family's sense of safety in their own home, and damaged the social fabric of your entire community. This court finds that your behavior constitutes a clear violation of federal hate crime statutes." Karen received 2 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She was ordered to pay full restitution to the Nguyen family, including medical expenses, therapy costs, lost income, and property damage. The total came to nearly $400,000, forcing her to sell her family home and liquidate her savings. But perhaps more significantly, she was required to complete 500 hours of community service working with immigrant families and attend mandatory diversity education classes. The judge made it clear that Karen's punishment was designed not just to penalize her actions, but to educate her about the communities she had sought to harm. The Nguyen family chose not to attend the sentencing hearing. They were busy with more important things. Tommy had made honor roll, despite missing weeks of school, and Lynn's latest art project was being displayed in the community center. Duke's auto shop was thriving again, supported by neighbors who had rallied around the family with fierce loyalty. Mai had returned to night shifts by choice, finding peace in the quiet hospital corridors where she helped heal others. She carried photos of her restored home in her wallet, pictures that showed not just repaired walls and replaced furniture, but a community that had chosen love over hate, inclusion over exclusion. On a warm evening in late spring, nearly a year after the raid, the Maple Creek subdivision hosted its annual block party. The event had taken on new significance, transformed from a casual social gathering into a celebration of community resilience and unity. Tables lined Elm Street, laden with dishes representing the diverse backgrounds of residents who had chosen to build something better from the ashes of that terrible November morning. Vietnamese PHO sat alongside Mexican tamales, Indian curry next to Italian pasta, American barbecue sharing space with Ethiopian injera. Tommy played violin for the gathered crowd, his music floating through the evening air like a benediction. Lynn sold her watercolor paintings at a booth decorated with butterflies, her smile bright and genuine as neighbors praised her artistic talent. Duke grilled vegetables on a community barbecue, his laughter mixing with the voices of customers who had become genuine friends. Dr. Chen stood with Mrs. Peterson, watching the celebration with quiet satisfaction. They had helped build this a community that had faced its own capacity for harm and chosen to become something better. Not perfect, perhaps, but stronger for having survived the test of its own values. "Do you think she understands now?" Mrs. Peterson asked, referring to Karen, who was serving her sentence in a federal facility 300 miles away. "Do you think she realizes what she destroyed?" Dr. Chen considered the question carefully, watching Tommy's bow dance across violin strings while his family beamed with pride. "I think she destroyed her own life more than theirs," she replied finally. "The Nguyens survived because they had each other, and because they found a community willing to fight for them. Karen lost everything because she chose hate over humanity. That's a lesson that can't be unlearned." As darkness fell over Elm Street, lanterns lit up the block party like stars come down to earth. Children ran between tables with plates of diverse foods, their laughter a testament to possibility and hope. Parents shared stories and phone numbers, building connections that would outlast any single crisis. The Nguyen house stood restored at the center of it all, its windows glowing with warm light, its front door open to welcome neighbors and friends. It had become more than just a home. It was a symbol of what communities could accomplish when they chose to stand together against hatred and fear. Mai stepped onto her front porch with a cup of tea, surveying the celebration that filled her street with joy and connection. The nightmares had faded, replaced by dreams of her children's bright futures in a community that had proven itself worthy of their trust. Duke joined her, his arms settling around her shoulders with the comfortable ease of two people who had survived something terrible together and emerged stronger. They watched their children play with neighbors' kids, saw Dr. Chen helping Mrs. Peterson to a chair, observed the 100 small acts of kindness that had replaced suspicion with solidarity. "We are home," Duke said softly, the words carrying weight far beyond their simple meaning. Not just the house that had been restored, but the community that had chosen to embrace them, the neighborhood that had learned to see difference as strength rather than threat. Mai nodded, understanding everything he meant and everything he didn't say. They had found their place in America not through the dreams they had carried from Vietnam, but through the nightmare that had tested every assumption about safety and belonging. They had discovered that home wasn't just a place you lived, but a community willing to fight for your right to exist within it. The block party continued late into the evening, voices and laughter carrying across a subdivision that had been transformed by crisis into something closer to its best possible self. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms. Adults made plans for future gatherings. A community that had nearly been fractured by hatred instead found itself welded together by the shared commitment to never let such harm happen again. When the last guests had gone home and the tables had been cleared away, the Nguyen family gathered in their living room for the evening ritual that had sustained them through their darkest months. Tommy practiced violin while Lynn painted. Mai read nursing journals, while Duke sketched designs for custom car modifications. They were ordinary people living an ordinary evening in an ordinary American home. But they had learned that ordinary life was itself extraordinary, that safety was a gift rather than a given, that belonging had to be fought for and defended and celebrated. Outside their windows, Elm Street settled into peaceful quiet, watched over by neighbors who had learned to see vigilance as protection rather than persecution, who understood that the true threats to community safety came not from difference, but from the hatred of difference. The story that had begun with a battering ram and terrified screams had ended with music and laughter, with a community that had chosen love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, truth over the comfortable lies that allowed hatred to flourish in the shadows of suburban respectability. In her federal prison cell, Karen Whitfield stared at court-mandated reading about the immigrant experience in America, beginning to understand for the first time the magnitude of what she had destroyed and the smallness of what she thought she had been protecting. She had 3 more years to learn what her neighbors had discovered in the space of a single traumatic year, that America's strength had always come from its ability to make room for people seeking nothing more than the chance to work hard, raise their children, and contribute to the communities that welcomed them home. The lesson would take time to sink in, if it ever did. But on Elm Street, the future was already being written by children who painted butterflies and played violin, by parents who healed the sick and repaired the broken, by neighbors who had learned that the price of community was eternal vigilance, not against the different, but against the hatred of difference itself. And in that warm, well-lit house at the center of a transformed neighborhood, the Nguyen family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had found their home in the only place it had ever truly existed, in the hearts of people willing to fight for each other's right to belong.